Jerk rulers, just like normal jerks in everyday life, have been all too common throughout history. Major difference, of course, being scale. If a king, queen, or other royal is a jerk or pulls off a jerk move, the impact could be orders of magnitude greater than the jerkiness of a random Joe Schmo. We are talking today about kings, queens, and other royals who pulled off jerk moves that range from the mildly distasteful to the utterly horrific. Vlad III regained the throne in 1456, this time with help from the Ottoman's enemies, the Hungarians. To celebrate, he invited 200 aristocrats and their families to an Easter Sunday feast in 1457. At some point, he asked his guests how old they were. He wanted to know who had been old enough to have participated in his father's overthrow back in 1447. He then dragged those who fit the bill outside and had them promptly impaled, a horrific way to die. Victims had large, sharpened, wooden stakes driven through their bodies, often through their rear end. The stake was then planted vertically into the ground, so that the victim was left to dangle in the air. Vlad impaled people in a manner that avoided damage to vital organs, and thus averted immediate death. Instead, the victims suffered hours or days of agony before they expired. To add an artistic touch to the horror, Vlad impaled aristocrats arranged in rows that came to be known as the Forest of the Impaled. The mass impalements did not halt Vlad the Impaler's Easter Sunday feast, and the party went on. King Ferdinand I of Naples, 1424 to 1494, ruled from 1458 until his death, and liked the logic of keep your friends close, and your enemies even closer. He was a capable ruler who brought peace and prosperity to his realm. Through diplomacy and strategic marriages, he created a network of interlocking friendships and alliances with other sovereigns. It made him so influential that he was nicknamed the Judge of Italy. He was also a generous patron of the arts and was an important figure in the Italian Renaissance. So much for Ferdinand's good side. As to the bad side that made him a jerk, Italian politics back then were not for the squeamish. The Italian peninsula was full of small states and independent cities, constantly on the brink of anarchy as rival aristocrats fiercely competed for power and prestige. Betrayals, poisonings, assassinations, murders, and wars were commonplace in what amounted to a real-life version of Game of Thrones, minus the dragons. Ferdinand had a vicious streak that allowed him to thrive in such an environment. After he killed his enemies, Ferdinand exhibited their corpses in what came to be known as the Museum of Mummies. Ferdinand I of Naples was not one to forgive and forget. As one historian put it, his pleasures were of two kinds. He liked to have his opponents near him, either alive in well-guarded prisons or dead and embalmed, dressed in the costume which they wore in their lifetime. In 1465, Ferdinand defeated some rebellious barons. In the guise of forgiveness, he invited several former foes and their families to a celebration, then arrested them when they showed up. Some were imprisoned for decades, and others were killed. One victim fell to his death after Ferdinand pushed him out of a window. One might think that nobody who had ever angered Ferdinand would accept an invitation from him again. Not so. On another occasion, some who had offended Ferdinand attended a wedding celebration at the king's residence, the Castel Nuovo. At the height of the merriment, they were suddenly arrested and whisked to the dungeons for torture, a death sentence after a quick trial and execution. Queen Victoria was an excessively prim and proper monarch, after whom the excessively prim and proper Victorian era was named. She was also a bit of a jerk at times. Take her attitude towards British looting and plundering of other countries. Nowadays, the British Museum faces a global pressure campaign to restore cultural and historical artifacts seized in the days of the British Empire. In her lifetime, however, Queen Victoria saw nothing improper about that. Her Majesty neither knew nor cared for modern sensibilities about such things. For example, in the Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860, British and French forces plundered, then destroyed and burned to the ground China's imperial summer palace complex. Among the loot seized and presented to Victoria was a small Pekingese dog, a breed previously unknown in Britain, that had belonged to the Chinese empress or one of the imperial ladies. Unlike the British Museum today, Victoria neither pretended not to know nor acted deliberately obtuse about how she got that bit of loot. Indeed, She rejoiced in the fact that the cute little pooch was looted, and so named it Lootie. Queen Victoria was many things, but PC wasn't one of them. Charles Edward Stuart, 1720 to 1788, commonly known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, has been greatly romanticized. Grandson of Britain's last Catholic monarch, the exiled King James II, Charles was the last serious Stuart dynasty claimant to the British throne. Stuart supporters, known as Jacobites, frequently rebelled against Britain's new ruling dynasty, the Hanoverians. The last such rebellion in 1745 to 1746, led by Charles himself as a young man in his mid-20s, culminated in catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Culloden in 1746. His dramatic escape afterwards cemented Charlie as a romantic figure of heroic failure. However, while thousands eagerly risked and willingly gave their lives for Charles, the Bonnie Prince probably deserved neither their admiration nor sacrifice. The real-life Charles Edward Stuart, as opposed to the romanticized Bonnie Prince Charlie, was a jerk. He was often a pretty seedy and slimy man. He was known for his grace and charm as a youth, but that only masked many dark facets of his personality. Among other things, he liked to beat up women, most notoriously his wife, Princess Louise of Stolberg-Gedden. He married her when she was 19 and he was 51. Obsessively controlling, he strung alarm bells around her bed at night to alert him if she tried to sneak off to see a lover. He beat her up so often that she begged the Pope for help. She was finally freed of his clutches when they separated after 12 years of marriage. Genghis Khan is one of history's scariest people, but he was not as lethal as an even deadlier medieval warrior. Timur, 1336 to 1405. By name Timur Lenk, which means Timur the Lame. In Turkish, Timur was the last great Eurasian steppe conqueror who terrified the civilized world with widespread devastation and butchery. He is chiefly remembered for his savagery and his massive rampage from India to Russia and the Mediterranean and points in between. Timur killed about 17 million people, or about 5% of the world's population at the time. That would be equivalent to almost 400 million people in 2023. A Muslim Turco-Mongol who claimed descent from Genghis Khan, Timur was born in the Chagatai Khanate in today's Uzbekistan. It was ruled by Genghis descendants at the time, and Timur's rise began in 1360 when he led Turkic tribesmen on behalf of the Chagatai Khan. However, the Khan was murdered by rivals, and that triggered a struggle for power. When the dust settled, Timur had emerged as the power behind a throne occupied by a figurehead Chagatai puppet, through whom Timur ruled. Timur's supposed descent from Genghis Khan was dubious. He nonetheless used it to justify his conquests as a restoration of the by then defunct Mongol Empire. He claimed that he sought to reimpose legitimate Mongol rule over lands that had been wrongfully seized by usurpers. With those justifications, Timur spent 35 years roiling the medieval world. In that stretch, he earned a reputation for brutal savagery as he brought fire and sword to the lands between the Indus and Volga rivers, the Himalayas, and the Mediterranean. Timur's most dramatic victory came at the expense of the Ottoman Turks. A rising power in their own right, the Ottomans were as exuberantly confident in their prowess as was Timur. For years, heated letters were exchanged between Timur and Ottoman Sultan Bayezid, until Timur finally showed up with his army in 1402, crushed Bayezid, and imprisoned him. To humiliate his prisoner, Timur kept him in a cage at court, while Bayezid's favorite wife was made to serve the victor and his courtiers, naked. Timur's decades-long rampage finally ended in 1405. As he prepared to invade China, he took ill and died before he could launch the campaign. His grave was reportedly cursed. Carved inside his tomb were the words, "When I rise from the dead, the word shall tremble."